I'm calling to you from the shadows of 1,000 years ago. The year is 1095. A great call is spreading from one corner of Europe to the other. Words echoing from the churches, crossing mountains, winding through valleys, reaching every village, every town. Everyone, absolutely everyone, is listening. Pope Urban II has taken his place among the crowd gathered in Clermont, delivering a passionate speech that echoes as far as his voice can reach. That voice, that address, is powerful enough to unite all of Europe under one cause. Jerusalem. Yes, Jerusalem, the jewel of faith and desire, a holy land soaked in blood. The land where Christ was crucified, the land that witnessed his miracles, is now held by foreign hands. The Pope's words echo across every corner of Europe. Will you take back those holy lands? Or will you accept this pain, this loss? It's more than a whispered promise, it's a command, an invitation. People, young and old, carve the cross into their flesh, strap on their swords, and prepare to set out, as if to write history themselves. But wait, this journey isn't as simple as a regular expedition. The Crusades. Sounds ordinary, doesn't it? But my friends, this isn't just an invasion or a war. Faith and ambition, hunger and sacrifice will intertwine the fight for survival, and the sacred mission will blur together on this road, each step stained with blood and tears. And together we'll take the first steps of this journey. We'll cross rugged mountains, desolate valleys, and enemy-infested lands. If you're ready, let's begin. But first, we must understand the great invitation that sparked this journey. So let's set off to learn the truths behind Pope Urban II's world-changing speech. My friends, now let's turn our eyes to medieval Europe. These lands, once home to the grandeur of ancient civilizations, now look entirely different, filled with castles and ruled by lords. This world is shaped by the power of religion. You'll find the mark of the Catholic Church in almost every stone, every palace, and every village. The massive cathedrals of the time reach toward the sky, and the cross symbol is an inseparable part of life in every European village. The church is not just a place of worship, it's a center of power that beats at the heart of Europe. Priests, archbishops, and even the Pope himself are often as powerful as kings, sometimes even more so. The church has gone beyond being a sacred guide for comforting souls and preparing people for the afterlife. It has become a force that shapes politics, the economy, and society. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was an authority that every king and noble had to seek approval from. Nobles, armed with swords, could not go to war without the Church's blessing. Furthermore, the duty of protecting and defending sacred relics was a call from the Church that reached into all layers of society. The Church was the entity that promised heaven, forgave sins, and had even kings and emperors bowing before it. At the very heart of this system is the feudal system. A lord grants land to his vassals, and the peasants living on this land work under the lord's protection. This rigid social order has strengthened the warrior nobility. These warrior lords of Europe have made fighting on horseback, sword in hand, a way of life. They defend their small worlds and protect their interests, even at the cost of bloodshed. So much so that, more often than not, they don't act without the Church's guidance and wait for a divine call to embark on a holy mission. However, during this time, great winds of change are blowing outside of Europe. In the East, the Byzantine Empire has lost much of its former glory, and its borders have grown increasingly smaller. Once the heir to the Roman Empire, Byzantium now struggles to hold its ground against the Islamic world. The Islamic world, on the other hand, has risen, building great cities, developing civilizations, and expanding its lands. This new power from the Arabian Peninsula has quickly spread to Anatolia and even Spain. As Byzantium shakes under the pressure of this strong wave coming from the east, it looks to the west for help. It is at this moment that the rise of the east and the turmoil of the west sow the seeds for another great conflict. Byzantium's cries for help begin to look like an opportunity that the Catholic Church and European nobility can't afford to miss. The holiest place in Christianity, Jerusalem. This sacred land is now in the hands of the enemy. The unrest in the heart of Europe is waiting for a spark to open the gates to distant lands. A spark that will unite the power of the Church and the nobility and send all of Europe into motion. So get ready for the next step, where we'll see how these religious and political forces come together and drive Europe toward a difficult journey to Jerusalem. Ah, my dear friends, now let me take you to another time, to the troubled days of the Byzantine Empire. Let's turn our eyes eastward, to those ancient lands once a mighty power. The Byzantine Empire is now being shaken by the rising tides of the Seljuk Turks. The Byzantine emperor at the time, Alexios I Komnenos, facing this threat to his throne and people, looks to the west for a solution, contemplating a decision that isn't easy at all. In such a difficult period, Alexios considers calling on his brothers in the west for help to ease the pressure of the Seljuk threat on Byzantine lands and perhaps regain some of the empire's former glory. Yes, while the Byzantine Empire seemed like a strong fortress in the east, after the Seljuk victory at Manzikert, Anatolia began slipping away from Byzantine control. The vast empire was starting to lose its strength and crumble. In Alexios's mind, the idea of uniting the Christian world to reclaim those lost lands begins to take shape. But you must know, the challenge Alexios faced wasn't limited to the Seljuks. There was also a deep rift with the Christian powers of Western Europe. The Catholic and Orthodox churches were divided by thick lines, with political tensions creating a significant distance between them. Therefore, Alexios's request for help from the Pope was not just a military one, but a major diplomatic move. Rebuilding a bridge with the West, perhaps even putting aside centuries of hostility, could bring the Christian world together under one roof to face the Islamic world. And so Alexios's call for help reaches the ears of Pope Urban II. At that time, Western Europe was also searching for a way out. Warrior nobles were in pursuit of new adventures and riches, while the Church sought an opportunity to unite and strengthen its power. Jerusalem, always a sacred and longed-for place in the Christian world, had a magnetic pull on Western Europe's nobility and warriors. The idea of liberating these holy lands was enough to draw them in. With Alexios's call, the interests of the East and West draw closer together than ever before. The Seljuk threat, the Byzantine plea for help, and the Pope's response all begin to arm Europe's greatest swords for this campaign. But my friends, this call for help will ignite not just a single campaign, but the spark for one of the greatest adventures of the Middle Ages. Ah, my dear friends, now let me take you to another turning point, to the heart of Western Europe, to those magical moments of the Council of Clermont in 1095. It was here, in the French town of Clermont, that words would echo, changing the fate of the entire Western Christian world. Pope Urban II, having gathered countless people, was about to deliver a speech whose echoes would resonate not only across European lands, but all the way to the distant lands of Jerusalem. Pope Urban II saw Alexios' plea for help as an opportunity. But this wasn't just about supporting Byzantium. There was a much bigger, much deeper ideal in his mind. The unity of the Christian world coming together for God's holy land. Imagine the Pope paints a picture of the suffering in Jerusalem, recounting the oppression and hardship Christians faced in the Holy Land. Yes, my friends, in that moment, the Pope's words rose like a flame, resonating in every heart. God wills it. With such power and faith in his voice, those gathered began to believe that God himself was speaking through him. The Pope, with the light of Jerusalem in his eyes and the suffering of Christians in his voice, extended an invitation to the people. Go to the Holy Land, he said, fight in the name of God, and earn your reward in heaven. Ordinary farmers, noble knights, devout monks. The entire Western populace responded with enthusiasm and faith. The people there were almost mesmerized by the Pope's words. From the crowd, voices rose in acceptance of the call, and a spirit that would be etched in history was born, the Crusader spirit. Friends, what started at the Council of Clermont was not just the preparation for a military campaign, it was the first step toward one of the greatest faith journeys in human history. The crowd gathered there, moved by the Pope's words, was ready to embark on a long journey to distant, unknown lands, to the holy city of Jerusalem. But how were they so eager to travel to such far-off, uncertain lands, perhaps never to return? It was in these moments that the Crusader spirit was born. With the Pope's powerful call and the people's enthusiastic response, medieval Europe began to prepare for a long and arduous journey to Jerusalem. Of course, my dear friends, now let me tell you about the first crowd that set out after the Pope's passionate call, with their eyes fixed on Jerusalem. In those days, the Pope's words resonated so deeply that they spread like wildfire among the people. In churches, market squares, and narrow streets, this call was passed from mouth to mouth, affecting everyone, young and old, rich and poor. But the ones who stood out the most were the ragtag groups, people who had come from fields, villages, and small towns. These were not knights wearing armor or wielding swords. These were simple people who had sworn to make their way to Jerusalem to fulfill God's will. There was one figure who led this ordinary crowd, a name that would be remembered for years to come: Monk Peter, or as he was known, Peter the Hermit. This devoted monk, barefoot and humble, gathered the people around him, uniting them in the name of God. The journey is tough, full of dangers, but God is with us, he would say, giving hope to the masses. And so this great movement, later known as the People's Crusade, began under Peter's leadership. Tens of thousands, women, children, peasants, and untrained fighters set off on their journey, unarmed but filled with faith. At every city and village they passed, more people joined the group. Their hopes were high, their steps eager. But my friends, as much as there was excitement in this story, there was also great tragedy. This army of the people was largely unprepared, many with the wrong supplies for such a long journey. As they traveled, hunger and misery followed them. When they finally reached Byzantine lands, they were far from the heroic victory they had dreamed of. Most of them perished there, their hopes and dreams buried in those foreign lands. The First People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, came to a tragic end. The journey they had set out on to see Jerusalem became their tomb. Yet, my friends, it was through these struggles, the hardships, the lost lives, and the tears that something important was cemented. The spirit of the Crusades was a fire that could never be extinguished. The faith that had started with this difficult journey would continue, now stronger and more organized. Behind them, the noble armies were on the way. Knights, armored and mounted, were preparing for a much more structured campaign. This would not just be a journey for the sake of God, but a reflection of the West's desire to show its strength in the East. As preparations for that great crusade were completed, eyes turned once more toward the roads. But would this organized army meet the same fate as the People's Crusade, or was there a different path ahead for them? Of course, my friends, let me now take you on the first major march of the Crusader army. Imagine an army filled with warriors from different lands, each with their own goals, but united for a single purpose. These weren't just soldiers, each one was a hero with their own story, coming from different lands. As the four main Crusader armies set out with dreams of Jerusalem, their leaders were making moves that would change the course of history. First, there was the famous French leader Godfrey de Bouillon. He wasn't just a warrior, but a leader loved by the people for his piety and courage. Alongside him was his brother Baldwin, who, like Godfrey, was a knight burning with the desire to free Jerusalem. With them was Raymond IV of Toulouse, a powerful nobleman from southern France. Known as a brave and wise leader, he was among the strongest of the southern French nobles. Another army, led by Bishop Adhemar, came from northern Italy. Adhemar was the Pope's special representative, taking on the role of religious leader for the Crusade. These four leaders, along with hundreds of knights and tens of thousands of soldiers, set off on a monumental march toward the Holy Land. The Crusaders took different routes. Long, dangerous paths awaited them as they journeyed east through Germany, France, and Italy. The Germans traveled along the Rhine River, passing through the northern regions. The French crossed the Alps, navigating difficult mountain passes. Battling rough terrain, harsh weather, and hunger, they pressed on. The Italians traveled by sea, hoping to reach Byzantine Empire lands. Each route had its own challenges, but every soldier knew that every obstacle was a test to be faced, continuing on with faith and determination. The difficulties they faced during this journey were much greater than you might imagine, my friends. Along the way, diseases broke out and hunger and thirst devastated many soldiers. Crossing hot deserts, finding water became nearly impossible. Some soldiers continued on, their lips cracked from thirst. Some froze to death in the cold mountain passes. Yet in their eyes, these hardships were just steps to be taken, challenges to overcome to reach the gates of Jerusalem. Finally, they arrived at the magnificent city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders were in awe of the city's splendor, the high walls, golden domed churches, and bustling, colorful markets filled with traders from all over. But there was also an underlying tension. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I wasn't exactly thrilled about such a massive army showing up at his doorstep. While the Crusaders tried to persuade the Byzantines to support them, they couldn't help but wonder what kind of plans the emperor might be secretly making against them. In this city, a great waiting began as the Crusaders prepared to continue their march toward Jerusalem. So, my friends, having crossed Byzantine lands and drawn so close to Jerusalem, would the Crusaders be able to achieve the victory they had dreamed of? Ah, my dear friends, let me take you now to the dazzling splendor of Constantinople during its prime. Back then, this city was like the beating heart of an empire, a golden bridge that connected Europe and Asia, bringing together cultures, trade, and wisdom. With its high walls, massive domes, and grand churches, it was so magnificent that, in the eyes of the Crusaders, it almost glowed like a piece of paradise. But unfortunately, as stunning as this city looked from the outside, the Crusaders were about to face a complex and difficult negotiation process. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, was quite uneasy with the Crusaders' arrival. He knew full well the kind of threat such a large army passing through his lands could pose. When the Crusaders, numbering in the tens of thousands, finally reached the borders of Byzantium, they were eager to meet Emperor Alexios. They needed to pass through Byzantine lands on their way to Jerusalem, but this journey was certainly not going to be a simple walk in the park. Although Alexios welcomed them politely, he had deep reservations about them. To him, the Crusaders weren't just devout soldiers fighting for the Holy Land, they were also foreigners who could potentially threaten Byzantium. Alexios engaged in long negotiations with the Crusader leaders. During these talks, he expressed his willingness to support them, but with one condition: the Crusaders had to swear that they would give the lands they conquered to Byzantium. This was a tough decision for the Western Knights. These soldiers, burning with the desire to liberate Jerusalem, didn't want to lose the right to hold onto the lands they had conquered. However, they needed the emperor's support to pass through Byzantine territory, and in the end, the leaders reluctantly agreed to these tough terms. Although the agreement between the Byzantine emperor and the Crusader leaders looked perfect on paper, there was always an underlying trust issue between the two sides. How much could Alexios trust the Crusaders' oaths? He knew the struggles they had faced on their long journey, their hunger, their thirst. Who's to say they wouldn't eventually set their sights on Constantinople's glory and decide to attack his lands? On the other hand, the Crusader leaders were well aware of Alexios' suspicions. However, the fact that Alexios allowed them to stay in the great cities of Byzantium and provided them with food, weapons, and guides did ease their concerns, even if just a little. Still, deep down, both sides knew that, given the right opportunity, they wouldn't hesitate to betray each other. In the end, despite all the uncertainty, the Crusaders and Byzantium decided to move forward with what seemed to be a solid alliance on paper. Now, with Byzantium's support, the Crusaders were preparing to take the next step on their holy journey to Jerusalem. Ah, my friends. When the Crusaders crossed the Byzantine borders and entered Anatolia on their difficult journey to the Holy Land, they were met with an entirely new set of challenges. This land was under the control of the Seljuk Turks, and although the Byzantine Empire had promised to guide the Crusaders, advancing through Anatolia's rugged terrain was anything but easy for them. Anatolia was a land full of rocky hills and mysterious passes, where danger lurked around every corner. After the relatively peaceful progress they had made in Byzantine territory, the Crusaders suddenly found themselves in the midst of a whole new battle. The first major obstacle in their path was the city of Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuks. Nicaea was a powerful city surrounded by strong walls, ruled by Sultan Kilij Arslan I. When the Crusaders decided to lay siege to this ancient city in 1097, they knew their task would not be an easy one. But if they were to reach Jerusalem, they had to pass through this city. While the Crusaders besieged the city, the Seljuk soldiers did everything in their power to push them back. However, the Crusaders, together with the Byzantine forces, were determined and patiently pressed against the gates of Nicaea. The support of Byzantine Emperor Alexios gave them the strength to keep fighting. Finally, after days of siege, Nicaea fell to the Crusaders. But this victory also caused a bit of tension between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, as the city was handed over to the Byzantines, and the Crusaders had to continue their journey to another front. After their victory at Nicaea, the Crusaders began advancing deeper into Anatolia. But my friends, just as the land was tough, the Turks also put up fierce resistance. In Dorylaeum, near modern-day Eskişehir, the Crusaders faced an even bigger battle. Sultan Kilij Arslan of the Seljuks had planned a strategic attack to stop the Crusaders' advance, and he attempted to surround them at Dorylaeum. That day, Anatolia became the site of a massive conflict. Kilij Arslan's light cavalry tried to force the Crusader army into a difficult position with a barrage of arrows. But the Crusaders did not back down. With their armor on, they tightly gripped their weapons and fought back against the Seljuk army with all their strength. This fierce battle became one of the first major victories for the Crusaders in Anatolia. In the Battle of Dorylaeum, the Crusaders fought with everything they had and successfully pushed the Seljuks back. This victory lifted their spirits and strengthened their determination to reach Jerusalem. But my friends, passing through Anatolia was not only about fighting battles. They had to battle the harsh terrain, hunger, thirst, and the scorching heat. At night, as they gathered around their campfires tending to their wounds, their eyes were always alert, because these lands continued to challenge them. In the end, with their victory at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders pressed on deeper into Anatolia. But remember, my friends, this was just the beginning of their journey. There were still mountains to climb and enemies to defeat. The path to the Holy Land was full of even more challenges waiting for them. All right, my friends, let's witness the Crusaders' march toward Antioch through the dusty pages of history. Ah, these Crusades. Armies from all corners of Europe, driven by faith as much as their ambition and determination, were pressing forward across the vast lands of the Middle East, soaked in sweat and blood. Along the way, they had faced numerous hardships. Hunger, disease, and fierce battles had taken their toll. Each of them had set out to reach the Holy Lands, to fight in God's name, but none of them could have known how tough this journey would be. Then their path led them to ancient Antioch, this mysterious fortress of the East. Antioch. Even back then, it was a city that had hosted many cultures throughout history, a fortress nearly impossible to capture. Rising between the Orontes and Euphrates rivers, it wasn't just a strategic point for the Crusaders, but also a symbol of victory they hoped to claim. On one hand, they wanted the glory of taking Antioch, but on the other, they felt the tense unknowns waiting behind its powerful walls. And so in those harsh days of 1097, the siege began. The Crusader armies had surrounded the city, but things were far from easy. The city not only had formidable walls, but the resistance inside was also standing strong against them. Days passed, and months followed one another. The Crusaders' patience was wearing thin. A large part of the army was breaking down due to the hunger brought by the long siege, while epidemics spread throughout the camp. In these harsh conditions, many soldiers fell victim to starvation and illness. Most of them started to doubt whether God was still protecting them. There were times when finding food was almost impossible. To survive, they had to eat leaves and even roots. Can you imagine? These people fighting hunger and exhaustion for a holy cause, each one a hero ready to face death. But the Crusaders were not only struggling with hunger, they were also dealing with internal conflicts. Coming from different kingdoms and speaking different languages, they began to turn on each other. Suspicion crept in, jealousy became a fire that blinded even the commanders. Sometimes the internal disputes among them were more damaging than the enemy outside the walls of Antioch. But despite all this, they had sworn to press on. There was no turning back, no retreat. Finally, a glimmer of hope appeared. One of them managed to strike a deal with a guard named Firuz, an Armenian. Firuz, having fallen out with the city's rulers over personal grudges, agreed to surrender Antioch to the Crusaders. Ah, how strange humans are, right? Sometimes a whole city can be taken over by a person's personal bitterness or anger. And so, Firuz made a secret deal to let the Crusader armies into the city under the cover of night. On one of the tensest nights of the siege, the Crusader soldiers, guided by Firuz, slipped inside the city's walls. The battle was now inside the walls. Fierce fighting continued in the narrow streets of Antioch. Though the city's defenders put up a strong resistance, the city eventually fell into the hands of the Crusaders. This victory was an incredible morale boost for them. After months of hunger, illness, and brutal battles, they were now filled with the joy of victory for their holy cause. But right after this victory, a much greater danger awaited them. The city had been captured, but the cost of holding Antioch had not yet been paid. Now let's talk about the new enemy the Crusaders would soon face, and how this tough struggle would continue. What was the new danger lurking just behind the walls of Antioch? Ah, my dear friends, the capture of Antioch had given the Crusader army a huge boost in morale. Yes, but they didn't even have time to savor their victory. Because even though they had won, it left behind an overwhelming exhaustion, tough roads still ahead, and new enemies rising against them. While the echoes of their victory still rang in the streets of Antioch, a new ray of hope had begun to shine within the city, a miracle. The discovery of a holy relic. It was the legendary spear, later known in history as the Holy Lance. And this discovery was about to give the Crusaders the spiritual fire and renewed faith they had long needed. Not long after the tough siege of Antioch, rumors began spreading among the soldiers. According to the rumors, the holy spear that had pierced Jesus' body during the crucifixion was buried right there, in Antioch. Many of the Crusaders, as soon as they set foot on this sacred land, had seen themselves as God's messengers, believing that God would create a miracle to help them. And when a monk claimed to have seen the spear's location in a dream, this belief spread like wildfire through the entire army. Isn't it strange how the human soul works? Even in the darkest of times, it searches for a light of hope, and when it finds it, it holds on tight. And that's exactly what the Crusaders did. When they reached the location of the spear, trembling hands began to dig. That moment felt blessed, filled with prayers full of faith and whispers from hearts beating with hope. Finally, when the old rusty spearhead was pulled from the earth, an indescribable wave of joy surged in the hearts of everyone there. It was a sign from God, a message that He was watching over them. Of course, some historians argue that the spear was just a symbol, perhaps just a regular spearhead. But in that moment, no one wanted to believe that. This spear brought the soldiers courage and strength. For the Crusader army, now dedicated to a holy mission, it wasn't just their weapons that would lead them. They believed they were also empowered by the strength of this sacred relic. After this discovery, the army reorganized. Looking beyond the walls of Antioch, they saw the tough road ahead to Jerusalem. They were exhausted, their numbers had dwindled, and their food supplies were running low. But with the discovery of the spear, the faith and determination that filled them renewed their spirits. Despite all the fatigue and losses, the commanders decided to march toward Jerusalem. The holy city was waiting for them, and to turn back would mean questioning their loyalty to God. As they set off, they were no longer moving forward only with the strength of their bodies, but also with the determination of their spirits. Even as they trudged through the scorching earth, starving and thirsty, no one complained. The Holy Land seemed to guide them like a light. As the army moved forward, renewing itself and strengthening its faith, the determination within them grew stronger. Days turned into weeks, and nights into long hours, but despite their dwindling numbers and the harsh conditions, the undying light of hope inside them brought them one step closer to Jerusalem and their victory. But what other dangers awaited them on this journey? Jerusalem, the ancient city that has left its mark on the stage of human history, where beliefs come together and break apart, and where sacredness fills every corner. My dear friends, for the Crusaders, Jerusalem wasn't just a target, but a holy relic, a treasure promised by God. After months of hunger, disease, and internal conflicts, the thought of that sacred city before them would light a fire in their hearts. They were tired, yes, their numbers had dwindled, and their hearts were heavy with sorrow. But their faith, that was the strongest weapon, the one that helped them overcome every challenge along the way. With the spiritual strength they gained from the victory at Antioch and the legend of the Holy Lance, they began their march toward Jerusalem. This journey, while carrying a spark of hope, was also filled with relentless enemies. As the Crusaders drew closer to Jerusalem, the local populations and Muslim armies grew even more determined to stop them. Along the way, they faced various battles, ambushes, and surprise attacks. Yet, every battle, every struggle seemed to strengthen their resolve. Each victory or step forward reminded them that they were getting closer to the gates of Jerusalem. But my dear friends, reaching Jerusalem wasn't as hard as taking it. When they surrounded the city and laid siege to it, they realized they were facing an entirely different challenge. The Muslims defending the city, with their unwavering faith, began their resistance behind the walls. Jerusalem was sacred, not only in the eyes of the Crusaders but to the Islamic world as well. Therefore, as determined as the Crusaders were, those defending Jerusalem were equally resolute. The siege lasted for days. The Crusader army developed various tactics to break into the city. They built wooden siege towers and constructed makeshift ramps to overcome the trenches and reach the walls. But my friends, believe me, this wasn't an easy task. Jerusalem was surrounded by high walls, and the defenders were waiting at every corner. Every stone, every arrow, every drop of water was precious. They tried every possible way to enter the city sometimes. They engaged in fierce battles right at the foot of the walls, Other times, the towers and ramps they built with hope were destroyed by rainstorms of stones and fire arrows from the walls. Under these conditions, maintaining motivation was no easy feat. Many of the soldiers were on the brink of collapse due to hunger and disease. But that's when, my friends, the miracle of the Holy Lance shone as a new light of hope. The commanders constantly reminded the soldiers that God was with them, and that the reward for this sacred mission was Jerusalem. Particularly, their leaders kept their faith alive, believing that God had chosen them for this holy city. As they laid siege to Jerusalem, they wanted to feel God's guidance with every step they took, and with every blow they invoked His name. Day and night, they prayed and encouraged each other with patience and endurance. And finally, after a long siege, the Crusaders managed to break through the walls. When they set foot on the Holy Land of Jerusalem, a wave of indescribable joy filled their hearts, and all the fatigue, pain, hunger, and diseases they had endured for years seemed to vanish in an instant. But my friends, behind that moment of victory, there were far deeper stories to be told. The fall of Jerusalem. Those moments that would leave the deepest marks on people's minds, the moments when joy and sorrow mixed in the embrace of a great victory. My dear friends, when the Crusaders entered Jerusalem, they were burning with the pride of having achieved a dazzling victory. But you must know, this victory came at a cost that was anything but light. As soon as the Crusaders set foot in Jerusalem, they were filled with the intoxicating rush of having conquered the Holy Land. They had finally reached the land they had dreamed of for centuries, the land they had mentioned in their prayers. But oh, my friends, this is where history showed its cruel face. The battles during the conquest and the unfortunate massacres that followed cast a huge shadow over this great victory. The Crusaders, seeing the people as enemies, ruthlessly walked over them, flooding the streets of Jerusalem with blood. These massacres, indiscriminately carried out on Muslims and Jews alike, without regard for religion, became the dark side of the conquest, etched into the pages of history. Those who lived through those days may have witnessed some of the most horrifying scenes of their lives. My dear friends, the true face of this conquest wasn't just about jubilation, but also about this indescribable tragedy. The capture of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Every soldier who returned to Europe and told the story of Jerusalem's fall was greeted with prayers and gratitude in the churches. From France to Germany, from Italy to England, celebrations of this victory were held everywhere. Jerusalem was now in the hands of the Crusaders, and for Christians across Europe, this was a source of great joy. Those who had the chance to take part in this victory were seen as heroes by the people. However, for some Crusaders who had endured the exhaustion of war and the long journey, the desire to return home had turned into an unquenchable fire. My dear friends, for some, this holy mission was over. The longing for home began to gnaw at their hearts, and they thought it was time to head back to Europe. On the other hand, efforts to establish solid control over Jerusalem had begun. The Crusaders set to work tirelessly to impose order on the city. During the rebuilding process, they constructed churches and declared holy sites to be inviolable. The leaders of the Crusader army built castles, walls, and checkpoints to strengthen their control over Jerusalem. These walls surrounding the city would not only protect Jerusalem, but also become a beacon of hope for any new military forces arriving from Europe. And so, my dear friends, the conquest of Jerusalem went down in history as a great victory. Yet, it left behind streets soaked in blood and memories of those difficult days. While the soldiers who returned to Europe brought tales of victory to their homelands, those who stayed in Jerusalem had to fight on to protect this holy city and their faith. Now I ask you, when the cost of a victory is this high, can we still celebrate that victory? My dear friends, there were those who believed that once Jerusalem was captured, everything would be over and all the goals would be achieved. But no, The real adventure was just beginning with the first steps taken to stay and protect these holy lands. After the conquest of Jerusalem, the Crusaders deeply felt the need to establish a long-term order here. They knew that not only Jerusalem but the entire region needed to be brought under control. And so, these thoughts laid the foundation for what would later be known as the Crusader states in history. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established as a symbol of the Crusaders' great victory. This new state, rising in the heart of Jerusalem, would become one of the Crusaders' strongest footholds in the Middle East. After the Kingdom of Jerusalem, other Crusader states such as the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa also began to take shape, one by one. Each of these states was of strategic importance to the Crusaders, ensuring that their presence in the region would remain long-term. My dear friends, the creation of these states was the strongest evidence of the Crusaders' efforts to make their presence in the region permanent. However, it wasn't hard to predict that these new kingdoms and counties would face far more challenging struggles than they had expected. The Muslim emirates in the region viewed the Crusaders' efforts to establish a permanent order with suspicion and even hostility. The capture of a city as holy as Jerusalem by the Christians had sparked the anger of not only the Muslim world, but also the Arab tribes. The Seljuk emirs, who had ruled these lands before, found themselves facing the Crusader states while trying to maintain their own balance of power. Especially the leaders of major cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul saw the Crusaders' presence in the region as a constant threat. And my friends, this tension marked the beginning of the long wars between the Crusaders and the Muslim Emirates, as well as the ongoing struggles between East and West. The Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states had to strengthen their defenses to survive these threats. They built powerful fortresses at strategic points like Tyre Acre and Tiberias. These fortresses, my friends, would serve as safe havens for the Crusaders. These structures, built on roads, passes, and hills throughout the region, not only symbolized the military strength of the Crusaders, but also served as a display of power, intimidating the local population. The Crusaders not only sought to secure the region but also set their sights on the surrounding Muslim lands. Thus, the Crusader states' expansion efforts began. They wanted to establish order in the Middle East, but of course this would not be welcomed by the Muslim leaders in the region. My dear friends, history is at a crossroads here, where both sides were preparing for fierce battles to gain power. While the Crusader states sought to strengthen their position and establish solid dominance, the Muslim leaders in the region also sped up their preparations to protect their lands and reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem. The fate of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states depended not only on their weapons and fortresses, but also on their relationships with the people of the region. Now, my friends, think about it. In such a tense environment, how would these states survive? And one day Jerusalem would once again be shaken, as the Muslims would seek to take it back into their hands. Ah, my dear friends, imagine that Jerusalem has been conquered, new Crusader states have been established, and the joy of victory is spreading throughout the Christian world. But these victories would leave deep marks, not only on the battlefield but also in social and political life. Now East and West were intertwined, not just geographically but in terms of beliefs and power as well. The new world brought by the Crusades reshaped the fate of Europe, the Muslims, and Byzantium, my friends. At this point, many peoples found themselves face to face with cultures they had never known before. These encounters led to conflict in some regions while sparking cultural exchanges in others. Let's first focus on Europe. After the Crusades, the Catholic Church had gained a powerful card. The Pope had demonstrated his ability to unite the Christian world and strengthened his spiritual authority. The Church's role in this victory ensured that, in Europe, political power would sit at the heart of faith. My friends, during this period, a concept known as the Crusader spirit began to rise. People became so deeply committed to the idea of protecting God's holy land that, all over Europe, the desire to be a crusader became almost a passion. Young men took up arms to seek their name and reputation in this sacred cause. The Crusades had become a form of heroism, even sanctity. The enthusiasm that swept through the Christian world would remain as an ideology for centuries to come. However, in the East, this was far from something to celebrate. For the Muslim world, the Crusaders were like a storm suddenly invading their lands. The loss of Jerusalem caused deep anger and, at the same time, an awakening within the Muslim societies. After this loss, the quest for unity in the Islamic world grew so strong that various city-states and emirates began to warm up to the idea of forming alliances to resist the Crusaders. My friends, the seeds of this unity and desire for resistance would later give rise to great Muslim commanders, like Saladin and many others. For the Muslim communities, reclaiming Jerusalem was not just about land, it became a sacred cause. So the Crusades would leave their mark in this region as the beginning of a conflict. And then, of course, the Byzantine Empire. Ah, poor Byzantium. This ancient empire, which sought the support of the Crusaders to defend its own lands, had failed to realize the ambitions of the forces it had invited. Initially, the presence of the Crusaders seemed like a hope for Byzantium's security, but soon that hope turned into anxiety. As the Crusaders sought to establish permanent footholds in the East, tensions began to arise in their relationship with Byzantium. The capture and holding of cities like Antioch by the Crusaders weakened the authority of Byzantium, and the trust between the Crusaders and Byzantium was broken. Thus, Byzantium found itself in a more cautious stance toward this new power, which seemed to be its ally at first. This situation contributed to Byzantium's weakening. Under the shadow of the Crusades, Byzantium entered a period of decline, which would continue until the rise of the Ottoman Empire. My friends, the consequences of the Crusades did not end here. They began a transformation that would last for centuries. The movement from Europe would build a bridge between East and West, touching everything from trade and culture to beliefs and politics. So were the marks left by the Crusaders truly permanent, or would they fade away into the dust of history? Ah, my dear friends, we've reached the end of our journey. Today we've followed the trail of that great expedition that stretched from Europe to the Holy Land of the East. Imagine this for a moment. We traveled back hundreds of years and saw the Crusaders' holy wars under the shadow of Jerusalem's high walls. We watched with our own eyes as those mighty armies gathered and set off, crossing vast deserts and engaging in fierce battles, writing history with every step. Sometimes they fought hunger, sometimes the enemy, and sometimes each other, but in the end, they became the heroes of this epic. Yet we never forgot that every victory, every city conquered, and every step taken came at a price. The Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem led them into a struggle that would last for centuries. As Muslims and Christians fought for control of the holy city, the hatred, stubbornness, and faith that shaped this land's history took root. Jerusalem became a place drenched in blood, but also a symbol of hope for hearts thirsty for peace. Isn't it interesting that, even in the midst of wars and conflict, humanity found ways to pass on its culture, faith, and values? What began as a call from Byzantium sparked a series of events that would lay the foundation for centuries of complex and deep relationships between Europe and the East. You see, my dear friends, history is just like this. The echo of a single event can stretch across centuries. A decision made by one people can change the fate of others. Today, we've not only followed the Crusades, but we've also traced humanity's determination, the clash of beliefs, the struggle for power, and the fine line between cultures. After all, who could have known that an army setting out would leave such a deep mark on both Europe and the Islamic world? Who could have guessed that Jerusalem, beyond being just a city, would become a symbol that would live on in people's hearts and minds throughout history? And perhaps at the end of this journey we've learned this: no matter how different we are, when people fight for their beliefs and values, they always carry the same passion, the same fervor. History is a story shaped and molded by these struggles. Now, my dear friends, we'll continue following the traces of these legends in other adventures. Today we walked together down the dusty roads of those distant, unforgettable days, saw the faiths that crossed those towering walls, and listened to the echoes of history in every corner. So here by the fire, as we send a salute to the past and try to understand the present, let's remind ourselves of this history as a mirror. The more we look into it, the better we understand who we are, where we come from, and where we are headed. Until we meet again in other stories, in other legends,